The first time I met Richard, he told me a story about holding a dying soldier in his arms in Fallujah, and in that moment, I felt like my brother's memory was finally understood. He looked me right in the eye, his gaze steady and filled with a sorrow I knew all too well, and the world suddenly felt a little less lonely. It wasn't until I found his high school yearbook from the year he claimed to be deployed that I realized the man holding our broken community together was a ghost. My older brother, Ben, was killed by an IED 6 months after his second deployment. He was 26. I was 22. The world didn't just stop, it shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. Ben was my everything, my protector, my confidant, my hero. He was the one who taught me how to ride a bike, who held my hand at our parents' funeral when I was 16, and who promised he'd be home for my college graduation. He wasn't. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight that settled in my chest and made it hard to breathe. The well meaning "I'm sorry for your loss" and the casseroles left on my doorstep felt like empty gestures from people who couldn't possibly comprehend the gaping hole Ben's absence left behind. I was working as a paralegal, a job that required meticulous attention to detail and emotional detachment, both of which became nearly impossible. I'd find myself staring at a legal brief, the words blurring as my mind replayed the last phone call with my brother, his voice crackling with static and optimism. It was my boss, of all people, who suggested the support group. His nephew had been in the service. He handed me a crumpled flyer with a clip-heart eagle on it, Hearts of Valor, a sanctuary for Gold Star families. I almost threw it away. The idea of sitting in a circle, sharing my pain with strangers, felt like peeling the scab off a wound that refused to heal. But the loneliness was starting to eat me alive. My friends were sympathetic, but they were busy getting married, having kids, and living the lives Ben would never have. I was an island and the tide was rising. So, one Tuesday evening, I found myself in the basement of a community center, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. There were about 15 people scattered on worn-out couches and mismatched chairs. Their faces were etched with the same silent pain I saw in the mirror every morning. And at the center of it all was Richard. He was about 60, with a kind, weathered face, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and eyes that seemed to hold a universe of understanding. He wasn't wearing a uniform or any overt military paraphernalia, just a simple collared shirt and jeans. But he carried himself with a quiet authority, a sense of calm that instantly put me at ease. He introduced himself as the group's founder. "I'm a veteran," he said, his voice a warm, gentle rumble. "And like all of you, I know what it's like to lose someone you love in service to this country." That first night, I just listened. I listened to Susan, a woman whose hands trembled as she spoke about her son, Kevin, who had been killed in Afghanistan. She talked about how Richard's guidance had pulled her back from the brink, how his shared experience as a combat veteran made her feel seen in a way no therapist ever could. I listened to a father who choked back tears describing his daughter's last letter home. Richard didn't offer platitudes. He listened intently, nodding, his expression a perfect mirror of empathy. When he did speak, it was with a quiet wisdom that resonated through the room. He talked about the unique burden of a Gold Star family, the mix of pride and unbearable sorrow that no one else could ever grasp. He approached me after the meeting, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. "You must be Maya," he said warmly. "Ben's sister." I just nodded, my throat tight. "He's a hero," Richard said, and for the first time, the words didn't sound hollow. He then shared his story about Fallujah, not in a boastful way, but with a heavy, summer tone. He described the dust, the noise, the fear, and the profound, terrible intimacy of watching a young man die. He said the kid reminded him of Ben, full of fire and a sense of duty. In that moment, sharing that story, he built a bridge across my ocean of grief and pulled me to shore. I felt a connection, a sense of belonging I hadn't felt since Ben was alive. I left that night feeling lighter than I had in months. Hearts of Valor became my lifeline. I started volunteering, helping Richard set up the room, make coffee, and organize events. We'd have potlucks, memorial walks, and even a small scholarship fund in the names of our fallen loved ones. Richard was the heart and soul of it all. He remembered every child's name, their birthday, their favorite food. He'd call Susan on the anniversary of Kevin's death just to sit on the phone with her in silence if that's what she needed. He was a saint, a pillar of strength for a community of people who had none left. He was everything I needed, everything we needed. My work as a paralegal meant I often handled pro bono cases for veterans, helping them with VA claims and disability paperwork. It was a way for me to honor Ben's memory, to use my skills to serve the community he had died for. Richard was incredibly supportive, often referring vets to our firm who were struggling to navigate the bureaucratic maze. One afternoon, he asked for my help with a personal matter. He was trying to get a grant to expand Hearts of Valor, to create a dedicated space with better resources for the families. The application required extensive documentation, including personal records to verify his nonprofit leadership eligibility. It's a mountain of paperwork, Maya, he said with a weary smile. And you're the best navigator I know. I was honored that he trusted me. I told him to bring everything he had to my office on Saturday, and we'd sort through it together. That Saturday, he showed up with a large, disorganized box of papers. We spent hours sifting through financial statements, letters of recommendation, and his personal documents. As I was sorting a stack of papers, a small, laminated card fell out of an old wallet. It was a driver's license, issued in the late 1980s. The photo showed a much younger Richard, but what caught my eye was the birth year, 1965. I did a quick mental calculation. If he was born in 65, he would have been a teenager during the Vietnam War, the conflict he often alluded to as his formative experience. But his stories were always about the Gulf War, about Fallujah. He'd be the right age for that. I brushed it off as a simple mistake in my memory. Maybe he'd served in multiple conflicts. It wasn't my place to question him. Then, I found another document tucked into a folded newspaper clipping. It was a certificate of appreciation from a local Rotary Club, dated 1991. The clipping was an article about the club's annual charity drive, and it mentioned Richard by name, praising him for his tireless work as the event's chairman. The date struck me as odd. 1991. That was the year of Operation Desert Storm. The year he told Susan he was deployed in Iraq, the experience that bonded them over their shared understanding of that specific conflict. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. It was probably nothing. A simple mix-up of dates. My grief-addled brain was probably just getting things wrong. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The seed of doubt grew into a thorny vine that wrapped itself around my thoughts. For the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that grief was making me see shadows where there were none. Richard was a good man. He was the anchor for dozens of families, including my own. To question him felt like a betrayal not just of him, but of the entire community he had so carefully nurtured. Ben had always taught me to trust my gut, but my gut was now a raging civil war. My sense of justice, the very thing that made me a good paralegal, was at odds with my desperate need for the comfort Richard provided. I started paying closer attention during the support group meetings. I listened not just as a grieving sister, but as an investigator. I noted the way Richard's stories, while emotionally powerful, were often vague on specific details. He'd mention the heat of the desert, the camaraderie, the fear, but he'd skillfully sidestep questions about his specific unit, his rank, or the exact dates of his service. He'd deflect with a humble wave of his hand, saying, "The details don't matter. What matters is the brotherhood, the sacrifice. That's what we're all here to honor." And everyone would nod, their eyes misty, completely captivated. He was a master storyteller, a conductor of emotions. One evening, Susan was having a particularly rough time. It was the week of her son Kevin's birthday. She arrived late, her eyes red and puffy. She clutched a framed photo of a smiling young man in uniform. He would have been 30 today, she whispered, her voice cracking. The room fell silent. Richard moved to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. He didn't say much. He just sat with her, his presence a comforting weight. Later, he shared a story about being on a long deployment and missing his own daughter's 5th birthday. He spoke of the guilt, the ache of being so far away during a milestone you could never get back. He connected his supposed experience directly to Susan's pain, validating her grief in a way no one else could. That feeling, Susan, he said, his voice thick with emotion, it's a ghost that walks with you forever. But you learn to live with it. You learn to carry it as a testament to your love. Susan looked at him with such profound gratitude, as if he had just handed her the key to her own survival. Watching them, my stomach twisted into a knot. If he was lying, this was a masterpiece of manipulation. If he was telling the truth, my suspicion was a monstrous injustice. I knew I couldn't let it go. Ben's memory demanded the truth. His sacrifice, and the sacrifice of every person we honored in that room, was real. It was paid for in blood and years of lost life. The idea that someone might be using that sacred pain as a costume made me physically ill. I decided to do what I do best. I started digging. It began with a simple online search. I used the information from the paperwork he'd given me, his full name, Richard J. Peterson, and his date of birth. I ran his name through several public records databases and military service verification websites. Nothing. No record of service. No mention of a Richard J. Peterson with that birth date in any branch of the military. I told myself these databases could be incomplete. There could be a reason his records weren't digitized. My work as a paralegal gave me access to more powerful search tools. I spent my lunch breaks poring over databases, feeling like a traitor with every keystroke. Still nothing. It was like he didn't exist in the military world. He existed as a taxpayer, a homeowner, a member of the Rotary Club, but not as a soldier. The real breakthrough came from a place I never expected. I was helping my aunt clear out her garage one weekend when I stumbled upon a box of my old high school yearbooks. As I flipped through the dusty pages, an idea sparked. Richard was a local. He'd mentioned growing up just a town over. Our high schools were rivals. On a long shot, I drove to the local library and asked the research librarian if they had an archive of yearbooks from Northwood High, his alma mater. The librarian, a helpful woman named Mrs. Gable, led me to a dusty back room, and there it was, a row of yearbooks spanning decades. I pulled out the 1983 volume, the year he would have graduated. I found his photo in the senior portraits section. Richard Peterson. The same kind eyes, but with a full head of dark, unruly hair and a slightly goofy grin. And then I started flipping through the years he claimed to be deployed. I checked 1990, 1991, and 1992. And there he was. In the 1991 yearbook, under the Alumni News section, was a photo of him. He was standing next to a table at a school fundraiser, wearing a ridiculous oversized polo shirt and a name tag that read Rich Peterson, event coordinator. The caption underneath read, Northwood High alum Rich Peterson class of '83 returns to help our fundraising committee break all previous records. Thanks for your tireless community spirit, Rich. The year of Desert Storm. The year he was supposedly in Iraq. The year he used to build his foundational bond with Susan. But he wasn't in the desert. He was here, at home, coordinating a bake sale. I felt the air leave my lungs. The dusty silence of the library archive pressed in on me. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a lie. A comprehensive, deeply embedded lie. I slammed the book shut, the sound echoing in the small room. My hands were shaking. I had my proof. Definitive, irrefutable proof. The man who had become a father figure to a room full of broken people, the man who had comforted me in my darkest hours, was a fraud. And now, I was the only one who knew. The weight of that knowledge was crushing, and I had no idea what to do with it. The drive home from the library was a blur. The yearbook felt like it was burning a hole in my passenger seat. I felt a confusing mix of vindication and profound sickness. I had been right. My instincts hadn't betrayed me. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the impending devastation I knew this truth would cause. Every kind word Richard had ever said to me, every comforting story he had shared, now felt like a carefully crafted piece of fiction. The memory of him telling me about holding a dying soldier, the moment that had first made me feel safe, was now a grotesque violation. He hadn't just lied, he had stolen the sacred experiences of real soldiers, of men like my brother, and worn them like a costume to gain our trust. When I got home, I spread the evidence out on my coffee table, the printouts from the military databases showing no record of service, a copy of the Rotary Club article from 1991, and the yearbook photo. It was an open and shut case. As a paralegal, I was trained to see the world in black and white, in evidence and facts. The fact was Richard Peterson was a liar. The logical next step was to expose him, to protect the sanctity of my brother's memory and the honor of every man and woman who had actually served. But my heart wasn't a courtroom. The faces of the group members flashed through my mind. I saw the father who had started talking about his daughter again for the first time in years because Richard had encouraged him to share her story. I saw the young widow who was finally starting to smile, who had credited Richard with showing her that she could still have a future. And most vividly, I saw Susan. Susan, who had told me just last week that Richard had saved her life. I was ready to give up, Maya, she had said, her voice trembling. I didn't want to live in a world where my Kevin didn't. Richard, he sat with me. He didn't just talk about grief. He talked about his own struggles coming home. He made me feel like I wasn't crazy for feeling so broken. He gave me a reason to get out of bed in the morning. What would this truth do to her? It wouldn't just expose Richard, it would invalidate the very foundation of her recovery. The comfort she had found, the trust she had placed in him, would all be revealed as a product of deceit. Would her progress shatter? Would the darkness she had fought so hard to escape come rushing back in? The thought was unbearable. I would be taking away their saint, their savior, and for what? For the sake of a principle. I was trapped. If I exposed him, I would be destroying a sanctuary that, despite being built on a lie, was providing real, tangible comfort to people in desperate need. I would be inflicting a new, fresh wave of pain on a group of people who had already endured the worst pain imaginable. They would feel foolish, betrayed, and utterly alone once more. The community Richard had built would likely crumble, and I would be the one holding the hammer. But if I stayed silent, I would be complicit in his lie. I would have to sit in that room every Tuesday, listening to his fabricated war stories, watching him manipulate the emotions of my friends, all while knowing the truth. It would be a betrayal of my brother, Ben. Ben, who had earned his uniform, who had lived through the hell Richard only pretended to know. Every time Richard spoke of service and sacrifice, it would feel like a dagger in my heart. How could I honor my brother's memory by allowing a fraud to use it as his personal puppet show? The lie was a poison, and even if it was masquerading as medicine, it was still a poison. A few days later, there was an emergency meeting of the group. A young couple, the Millers, had just lost their son. He had been killed in a training accident overseas. It was their first time at a meeting, and they were shells of people, their eyes vacant with shock and fresh grief. They sat huddled together on the couch, barely speaking. Richard was at his absolute best. He was gentle, patient, and commanding in his quiet way. He didn't rush them to speak. He simply created a space of safety. He started by sharing a story, one I hadn't heard before, about the disorienting feeling of receiving bad news from home while deployed. He talked about the sense of helplessness of being a world away while life falls apart. He wasn't talking about combat. He was talking about the universal human experience of loss, but he framed it within the context of his service. Slowly, Mrs. Miller began to talk. She spoke in fragmented sentences about her son, about his love for baseball, about the last time she had spoken to him. The whole room listened, our hearts breaking with hers. Richard guided the conversation with the skill of a seasoned therapist, validating their every feeling, assuring them that their anger, their confusion, their numbness, it was all normal. By the end of the evening, the Millers weren't cured, but they were no longer completely shut down. They were breathing again. They were connecting with other human beings. They were looking at Richard as if he was a prophet. Watching him, my resolve crumbled. I saw the undeniable good he was doing. He was a fraud, a charlatan, a thief of valor. But he was also a healer. He possessed a rare and profound empathy that was, in practice, more effective than any grief counselor I had ever seen. The lie was the key that unlocked these people's pain, that allowed them to trust him. Without his shared experience, he would just be another well-meaning civilian offering useless platitudes. His lie was his power. I felt like I was at my lowest point, caught in an impossible ethical checkmate. Every choice was a betrayal. Betray the memory of my brother, or betray the fragile peace of the people who had become my second family. The weight of the secret was becoming unbearable. I drove home that night with a knot of dread in my stomach. The question was no longer if I should do something. It was what I could possibly do that wouldn't end in utter devastation for people I had come to care about so deeply. For a week, I was paralyzed. I skipped the next support group meeting, telling Richard I had a work deadline. The lie felt slick and easy on my tongue, and I hated myself for it. I avoided calls from Susan. The yearbook sat on my desk like a verdict waiting to be read. The two sides of the dilemma warred within me, leaving me exhausted and emotionally raw. One moment, I'd be filled with a righteous fury, composing speeches in my head where I would stand up in the middle of a meeting and expose Richard for the fraud he was. I pictured the shock, the anger, the satisfying, clean burn of the truth. But then, my imagination would drift to the aftermath. I saw Susan's face, not angry, but broken, the light in her eyes extinguished once more. I saw the Millers, so new in their grief, retreating back into their shell of silent shock, their first fragile step toward healing undone. I saw the community, our sanctuary, dissolving into a mess of accusations and heartbreak. The truth wasn't a clean fire, it was a bomb, and I would be the one to detonate it in a room full of wounded people. The other option, silence, felt just as impossible. It felt weak. It felt like letting my brother down in the most fundamental way. His sacrifice was not a story for someone else to steal. It was a fact, hard-earned and paid for with his life. Staying silent meant I was choosing the comfort of the living over the honor of the dead. It felt like choosing a comforting lie over a painful truth, and that went against everything I believed in. I finally realized there was no perfect answer. There was no path forward that didn't involve some form of loss. I had to choose the lesser of two evils, and that meant I had to decide what I could live with. Could I live with the guilt of my silence, or could I live with the consequences of my words? After a sleepless night, I knew what I had to do. My plan wasn't to blow everything up in a public spectacle. That would be cruel. It would center my need for justice over the group's need for stability. My target wasn't the group, it was Richard. He was the one who had to answer for his actions. I called him and asked if we could meet for coffee before the next meeting. I told him I needed to discuss something important about the grant application. He agreed without hesitation, his voice as warm and reassuring as ever. We met at a small, quiet cafe. For a few minutes, we made small talk. He asked how I was doing, and I gave vague answers. The knot in my stomach tightened with every passing second. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I reached into my bag and slid a folder across the table. Richard, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. I've been doing some follow-up research for the grant, just to make sure all our ducks are in a row. And I found a few things I don't understand. He opened the folder. Inside was a copy of the page from the 1991 Northwood High yearbook. His face, young and beaming in the photo, stared up at him. I had highlighted the caption, "Thanks for your tireless community spirit, Rich." He looked at the photo, then up at me. The kind, empathetic mask he always wore flickered. For a split second, I saw something else in his eyes, fear. Pure, cornered fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a look of weary confusion. "I don't understand, Maya. What is this?" he asked. "That's from 1991, I said, keeping my voice level. "You were a fundraiser for your old high school. But you told Susan, you told all of us, that you were in Iraq in 1991. You've built this entire community on the idea that you are a combat veteran. But you're not, are you, Richard?" The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. He stared at the yearbook page, his jaw working silently. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to lie his way out of it. He just deflated, the confident, charismatic leader vanishing before my eyes, leaving a tired, sad old man in his place. "No," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not." He explained, in a halting, shamefaced mumble, that he had tried to enlist when he was young, but a health issue had disqualified him. He'd spent his life admiring soldiers, feeling like a failure for not being one of them. When a friend's son was killed in action, he found himself at a nascent support group, and in a moment of weakness, he had lied. He said he was a vet to connect with a grieving father, to make the man feel understood. The lie had worked. It had brought comfort. And it had snowballed, growing bigger and more elaborate over the years until it became the foundation of his entire identity. "It started as a way to help," he said, his eyes pleading with me. "I saw how much pain they were in, and I wanted to take it away. The stories they helped. They gave people something to hold on to. I know it was wrong, Maya. God, you don't know how much I know it was wrong. But I have helped people, haven't I?" And there it was. The heart of the matter. He had helped people. He had saved Susan. He had given a community of broken souls a place to heal. He had done a good thing for a terrible reason. "What you've built is real, Richard," I said, and I meant it. "The comfort, the community, that's all real. But the foundation is a lie. And it's an insult to my brother and to every person who really did what you pretend you did." I told him he had two choices. He could either walk away from the group quietly, effective immediately, citing personal or health reasons, and I would keep his secret. Or I would tell everyone everything. I would hand the folder to Susan myself. I was giving him the chance to prevent the bomb from going off, to preserve the sanctuary he had built, even if he could no longer be a part of it. He sat there for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. I could see the war inside him. Letting go of Hearts of Valor would mean letting go of his life's work, his purpose, his identity. But being exposed would mean destroying it completely. Finally, he looked up, and his eyes were filled with a profound sadness. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it." At the meeting that night, Richard announced that due to unforeseen health issues, he had to step down as the group's leader, effective immediately. He kept it brief and vague. He said the group was strong enough to continue without him, and that he had made arrangements for a licensed grief counselor to help facilitate future meetings. The room was stunned. Susan openly wept. People begged him to reconsider. He held firm, his face a mask of regret. He looked at me only once across the room, a quick, fleeting glance that held a world of unspoken meaning. Then he walked out the door and out of our lives. The group survived. It was different, more clinical with the new counselor, but the core community held together. The foundation Richard had built was strong enough to stand without him. But the warmth, the almost magical sense of understanding he provided, was gone. Susan, while still attending, was more withdrawn, and I knew she felt abandoned. I carry the secret of who Richard really was. Sometimes, I feel a grim satisfaction in knowing I protected the group from a devastating truth while still upholding some semblance of justice. Other times, I'm overwhelmed with a sense of loss and ambiguity. I look at the grieving faces in the room and wonder if I made the right choice. I took away their flawed savior and gave them a sterile, honest replacement. Was a painful truth better than a beautiful, helpful lie? I still don't know the answer. So, tell me, what would you have done? Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. We appreciate everyone and can't wait to bring more stories your way.